This is WFYI News Now. It's October 3rd, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, local organizations provide help to people affected by Hurricane Helene. Republican gubernatorial candidate Mike Braun says he is replacing a doctored image in an attack ad. And we'll find out how new COVID-19 variants are different from previous ones.
So it's pretty interesting that as it mutates, the binding sites change, and as those binding sites change, the symptoms change.
Those stories coming up. But first, Indiana state lawmakers have slowly pulled money away from traditional public schools over the last decade. A Democratic state lawmaker says there's consequences in the classroom. From WFYI's education desk, Rachel Fredette has more.
About 36% of the state's tuition support dollars goes towards traditional public schools, an overall drop for classroom expenses since 2011. Democratic Representative Ed DeLaney says that must be addressed ahead of the state's upcoming budget discussion.
We have made, in my view, a conscious choice to turn our eyes away from education, specifically public education, and to downplay it. That's not an accident.
DeLaney said tuition support for all schools, charter schools and private school vouchers included, is down. That's despite vouchers garnering growth and money since they began in the state.
So we've decided to lower our support for all schools, but especially lower our support for traditional school corporations.
He cited poor college-going rates and third-grade reading scores as examples of what's failed due to the decline in funds. I'm Rachel Fredette.
Lawmakers will start discussing the next two-year budget in January. Local organizations are providing help to people affected by Hurricane Helene. The local Red Cross announced that 2 volunteers drove an emergency response vehicle to North Carolina on Tuesday. They went there to give out food and water to those dealing with the aftermath of the storm. Isis Chaveri, Red Cross Regional Communications Director, says the impact of the hurricane is significant.
This hurricane, has caused catastrophic damage, and it spans to hundreds of miles, and has uprooted the lives of communities, and in many cases, forever.
24 other volunteers from the Red Cross have already left Indiana to go southeast and bring aid to those in need. She said these volunteers will help bring relief.
So the volunteers do make a big difference in providing support and comfort to thousands of people.
Gleaners Food Bank and Midwest Food Bank are also providing help to those harmed by the hurricane. Gleaners has sent several truckloads of pre-built disaster boxes to sister food banks. Republican gubernatorial candidate Mike Braun says he is replacing a doctored image in an attack ad against Democrat Jennifer McCormick. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports the ad, which began airing this week, ran afoul of the state's new law governing digital manipulation of campaign materials.
The Braun ad altered a photo of a McCormick campaign rally to falsify the signs McCormick supporters were holding as they stood behind the Democrat. Braun says he didn't decide to doctor the image and that when he initially reviewed the ad, it looked okay. He says he's now decided to replace the altered image entirely and use the original photo without falsified campaign signs.
I think the content of what's in the ad will stick, and that's just telling the truth about where she's coming from.
The McCormick campaign called the original ad dishonest and accused Braun of being desperate to distract voters. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
And for our final story today, how are new COVID-19 variants different from previous variants? One of our listeners inspired this question. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports the significant difference between them comes down to how the virus interacts with the cells in the human body.
One of the big challenges between each variant is what's known as a binding site. A virus will travel along the surface of a cell until its proteins can bind with receptors. Dr. Scott Steinecker is a fellow for the Society of Healthcare Epidemiology and the medical director for infection prevention at Parkview Health Systems. He says the binding sites between variants are dramatically different.
So it's pretty interesting that as it mutates, the binding sites change, and as those binding sites change, the symptoms change.
The new vaccine targets the most recent family of variants, Omicron. Steinecker says while symptoms may change between variants, there hasn't been any significant change in the incubation period or the duration of the symptoms. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Zach Bundy and Drew Daudelin, with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.